So this is our lecture on the end of the Cold War. So we're going to start by talking about the decline of the Soviet Union. What happened along the way towards the 1970s and 1980s that led the Soviet Union to not be competing as well as they had been with the United States. So we'll go through a few things here. Number one, the Soviet economy. We've talked about this before, but just to reiterate, the Soviet economy was highly inefficient. They did not produce the goods and services that people actually wanted, and many of the goods that they produced were inferior in quality, and they also just didn't produce enough goods for the population of the Soviet Union. So if you wanted something like a car, you would have to go on a long waiting list for that car, whereas people in the United States could just go out and buy a car. People didn't have access to the clothing they wanted. When you went to the grocery store, there were empty shelves all over the place. And so the economy just was not functioning for your average citizen of the Soviet Union. Part of the reason for this was that the Soviet Union spent so much of its gross domestic product, of basically the money that it had, on its military. In order to keep up with the arms race, in order to keep up with the United States, the Soviet Union spent probably way more than it should have on its military, and an effect of that was that they could not invest in the people of the Soviet Union. So again, we see the average people of the Soviet Union suffering as the Soviet Union is trying to keep up with the United States militarily and economically. So both of these things really started to come to a head in the 1970s and 80s, and people were realizing that their situation was not great, and were starting to, feel like they wanted some change. One of the biggest reasons for the decline of the Soviet Union came in a war in Afghanistan. This was a long war, started in the 1970s and went throughout the 1980s. The Soviet Union was trying to support, kind of prop up a communist-style government in Afghanistan, but many of the people in Afghanistan did not want this government. They did not believe in this government, and therefore fought back against it. And we've mentioned this before, but the United States played a role in this. This was a proxy war, as we have talked about before. The United States did not fight in Afghanistan at this point in the 1980s, but we did send a lot of weapons to the Afghan fighters who were fighting against the Soviet Union to help them, take down Soviet helicopters and take out Soviet tanks and things like that. But this was a highly costly war for the Soviet Union. It was a war that dragged on and dragged on, that kind of brought the morale of the Soviet Union into kind of a lower situation. One thing that did happen that was, I guess we would call it perhaps more positive, was the policy of détente, which began in the 1970s. And it was a policy of reducing tension, right? The Soviet Union and the United States had great tension with each other since the end of World War II, and probably even before that. And so by the 1970s, there was a feeling that, we wanted to kind of have some sense of normalcy. So presidents like President Nixon, President Ford, and President Carter all worked to try to sort of reduce the tension between the US and the Soviet Union. But that all changed with the election of Ronald Reagan as President of the United States in 1980. He believed in taking a very hard line against the Soviet Union. He believed in really fundamentally challenging the Soviet Union, building up our military so they would have to build up theirs, building up our nuclear arsenal so they would have to build up theirs, and basically just trying to bankrupt the Soviet Union. So he pushed the tension, in a lot of ways, between the Soviet Union and the US to a higher degree than it had been in a long time. This alarmed a lot of people, but in reality it was something that put a lot of strain on the Soviet Union because they couldn't afford to keep up with us. They couldn't afford to put more money into their military than they already were to keep up with the arms race with the United States. So at this point, we are going to talk about some reforms that happened. So what I'm going to ask you to do is pause this video, and if you can refer to the document called Soviet Reforms, either in paper in the class or that's loaded on my website. And it talks about 3 reforms that happened in the Soviet Union. One is called Perestroika, one is called Glasnost, and one is called Demokratizatsiya. I probably said that totally wrong, but uh, you're going to read about those 3 things, and you're going to read about what the goal was and the outcome of each. And then when you're done with that, answer these questions as kind of in the middle of your notes. And then when you're done with that, you can restart this video. So please go ahead and pause and then restart when you're ready. All right, so we will pick up there based on that reading. We're going to take a look at a new leader that came to power in the Soviet Union that really fundamentally changed things. His name was Mikhail Gorbachev, and he was very different than any leader that had really come before in the Soviet Union. So first off, Gorbachev was someone, unlike all of the other leaders of the Soviet Union, that believed that it was okay to change. Everyone that had come before him really fundamentally believed in sticking to the hardline Soviet approach. Right? Don't give an inch. Don't make any changes. Stick to your guns and keep things as they are. And Gorbachev, again, was different. He believed in reform. He believed in changes. Now, you guys read about a few of his ideas. One was Glasnost, which means openness. And basically, this was the idea that the Soviet Union, which had been such a stifling society for so long, a place where you couldn't speak freely, a place where you couldn't have your own political opinions, or you couldn't be, an artist or a writer, if what you wrote or what you painted went against the ideal of the Soviet Union. Glasnost was the idea that, hey, maybe it's okay if people speak out against our government. Maybe it's okay if people express themselves freely. Such a radical idea for the Soviet Union, right? This had never been something that had been allowed in the Soviet Union. So to push this policy in the middle of the 1980s was a drastic change from anything that had come before. And the same thing goes for perestroika. So perestroika means restructuring. And again, the conservative line for a very long time is no changes. We make no changes. Perestroika said, you know what, if the government is not working, maybe we should take a look at that. Maybe we should see how we can reform it to make it better. Isn't the point of a government to serve its people? If it's not serving its people, maybe we can make some changes, right? So these 2 things were very important in challenging the old ways of the Soviet Union. So in that way, Gorbachev was a very radical leader in a lot of ways. However, once he started to put these policies into place, surprise, surprise, the problems that actually existed started to come to light. These are problems that had been there for a very long time. People's poor living conditions, the general poverty of the people in the Soviet Union. But they are things that you weren't really allowed to talk about. And now people could complain about them. People felt free to complain about them. And it kind of opened the floodgates. And the results were a little bit different than I think Gorbachev had expected. He wanted to remain a communist nation. He wasn't looking to abandon the idea of communism, the goal of equality, or anything like that. He just wanted the system to work better. But now so many people were so upset with how things were going that problems began to be exposed. And again, I'm going to ask you to pause this video, and on my website there is a link to a video called The Beginning of Perestroika. I'm going to ask you to, it's a short video, about 7 minutes. I'm going to ask you to watch that video now, and again, just kind of right in the middle of your notes, respond to these 2 questions. How did perestroika change people's lives in the Soviet Union? And were these changes all good, all bad, or somewhere in the middle? So again, pause this video, go and watch that video, the beginning of perestroika, respond to these questions, and then when you're done with that, come back and restart this video. Okay, so moving on. Final slide here of notes. So in the wake of these new policies of glasnost and perestroika, these changes that the new leader of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, was pushing, it really began to weaken the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, it turns out, was not as strong as it seemed. And the way that it maintained its appearance of strength was by keeping a very tight control on the message, very tight control on what people said, what people wrote about. And now that Gorbachev opened the door to free expression and to the idea of change in government, it showed exactly how weak the Soviet Union was. It showed how little they could do to provide for their people. And as they started to actually make changes to the government, make changes to the economy, it actually, in a lot of ways, did the opposite of what Gorbachev expected, and it made things worse. So for example, he believed that, okay, so if the economy is not doing enough to provide goods for the people of the Soviet Union, if they walk into a store and they see empty shelves, that's not good. Maybe we can restructure the economy slightly so that, we can have maybe a little bit more freedom for farmers to make what they want to make and deliver to the stores and so forth. But when they made that decision, when they started to restructure things, everything sort of collapsed. And instead of farmers rising to the occasion and providing what people needed, you had shortages. People weren't getting what they were used to, which was already really not very much. And now they were getting even less. And to think about it, right, we're talking about the 1980s. The Soviet Union had been a communist nation since 1917, a really, really long time. And really, like, no one in the Soviet Union had ever started their own business. No one had been an entrepreneur. No one had taken that sort of risk. So all of a sudden, for the government to open it up and say, hey, farmers, why don't you go ahead and become, capitalist farmers? No one really knows how to do it. And so, again, this really exposed the weakness of the Soviet Union. And in that atmosphere, in the 1980s, right around 1988, 1989, the countries surrounding the Soviet Union, who the Soviet Union had been controlling for so long, countries like Poland, countries like Hungary, countries like East Germany and Czechoslovakia, they started to sense that maybe this was an opportunity for them to go in their own direction. Think back to earlier in this unit, when two countries, first Hungary and then Czechoslovakia, decided that they wanted to go in their own direction. The Soviet Union in the 1950s and 1960s had sent in tanks, had sent in the Soviet army to stop those uprisings. They had executed people, jailed people to stop those uprisings. This time, those countries, again, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and others, they start to sense that maybe things will be different. And in fact, when asked, Gorbachev says that if other countries around Eastern Europe want to make reforms, he and the Soviet Union will do nothing to stop them. Once he gives that signal that he will not send in tanks or anything like that, those countries start to rush towards, and the people in those countries especially, start to rush towards making massive changes in how their countries are run. And so to see about that, we're going to do two things. The next assignment is looking at the anti-communist uprisings around Europe in 1989 through the early 1990s. And we're also going to watch a video on it when we're done with the reading assignment. So those are the two things that we're going to do involving this. That is all.